Rankin introduce you to Professor Reich. So Bob, Professor Rankin is a law professor at Seattle University. She's the director of the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project there, and just a great local leader here for coalition building on getting more of our on-house neighbors into permanent supportive housing. So just wanted to take a moment to introduce you guys.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Welcome everybody. It looks like we've got about 86 attendees so far, which is great, and I expect more folks will come in as we go along. But since we're 2 minutes after 2, I figured we'd get started in respect for our panelist time. My name's Andrew Lewis. I'm the Seattle City Council member for Seattle City Council District 7, which stretches from Magnolia down to Pioneer Square, South Lake Union, Queen Anne, downtown, Belltown, and other neighborhoods in sort of the western side of the city of Seattle. Elected in 2019, currently in the first very eventful 6 months of my 4-year term, and could not be more excited to represent the people of District 7 and to work alongside a lot of the great community members that are joining on this call. Just to give people a brief roadmap of kind of how I'm structuring this. So this is a town hall about a proposal that I floated last week to tax capital gains, well, I guess 2 weeks ago, to tax capital gains in the city of Seattle, to fund permanent supportive housing and the plans of the Third Door Coalition, which is an alliance late this spring or early this spring of business and service providers that came forward with a plan to get 6,500 new units of permanent supportive housing above and beyond what is currently planned for, to really help with our regional efforts to reach functional zero on our neighbors living in a state of chronic homelessness. So this town hall is going to have sort of 3 sections to it. First, at the top, I'm going to talk to a really special guest that I'm very pleased to have here, my old professor from the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Robert B. Reich, former United States Secretary of Labor and a noted and avid progressive economist, is joining us today to talk at a very high-level view about capital gains, kind of where they come from, what they are, why it is equitable and progressive to tax them, and why that is a source of revenue that governments can use to reach equitable and progressive ends through policy. And I'm very happy to have Professor Reich here. And that'll be the first part of the discussion. I'll just talk to Professor Reich, and he cannot stay for the entire time. But we will, I'll have a good conversation with him, and we can queue up some of your questions, and I can field them later if Professor Reich has already left at that point. But that'll be the first part of the town hall. Second part of the town hall, we're going to be talking to a panel, and I'm really proud to be joined by 3 extremely amazing community members that I've had the great pleasure of working with prior to taking office and during my time in office. Senator Joe Nguyen, who represents the 34th District, West Seattle, Vashon Island, White Center, and other parts of King County, who has been a champion of capital gains in the state legislature, and really happy to have him here to talk about his efforts down there and how we can sync up our efforts in Seattle and Olympia to have a more progressive tax system in Washington State. Executive Director Colleen Echohawk of the Chief Seattle Club, who is an expert in permanent supportive housing and a service provider who does great work in the Pioneer Square neighborhood and beyond here in the city of Seattle, who can talk about the merits of permanent supportive housing and how we can use it, scaling permanent supportive housing as a strategy for equitable and very social justice and race-conscious investments that are righting historical wrongs and making sure that we are on the path to being a more equitable city in how we build out our social services. And she's going to be joined in that conversation by Sara Rankin, Professor Sara Rankin of Seattle University School of Law and director of the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project at Seattle University, and a board member of the Third Door Coalition, an alliance of service providers and small business leaders who have been advocating for scaling up permanent supportive housing to reach functional zero on homelessness, on chronic homelessness. So with that, I'll transition to the first part now that we have the roadmap, and after those presentations, we will leave time for questions that'll be moderated by Camila Brown from my staff, who is also on the call. And I think that with that roadmap, I'll pivot now to talk to Professor Reich about capital gains generally. So first off, Bob, welcome to the city of Seattle, even if virtually. It's good to see you. Just as a little bit of background, when I was in law school at UC Berkeley, I had the great privilege of being both a student and a student instructor later for Professor Reich's class, Wealth and Poverty. A big portion of that class, which was formative in shaping my views on tax policy, was this discussion about how local governments, of which I am now an elected officer of a local government, are more overly dependent on regressive taxes than any other level generally of government. And also paradoxically, we do most of the governing here at local government and have a big caseload of what we need to provide for, mostly through, especially in our case, sales and property taxes. A big part of Professor Reich's course talked about different taxes that are out there in the world and how those taxes have a tendency through policy over the years to be lowered, reduced, loopholes to be created, and that has very regressive and inequitous consequences. So just to provide a little background on sort of my history with Professor Reich, and it's good to see him here to have this conversation about stuff that I know he's a great authority on, and it should be a really good town hall. So Bob, I guess I'll throw out a first question, and then feel free to preface it with with an introductory remarks or sort of other formalities before answering. But I'll throw out the first question just to start it way up at the 30,000 foot level. What are capital gains?
Well, I will answer that question at 30,000 feet and at 10,000 and at 2 feet in just a second, Andrew. But let me just thank you for inviting me, and thank you for initiating this proposal, this series of proposals. You were one of my best students. It was about 30 years ago, I think you were in my class. And I remember saying to you at the time, I hope you go on into politics and do something that is very much comes out of this class. And you said, sure. And then there you did. You went back home and you ran for city council. And I thank you for that.
Thank you.
And Senator Nguyen, it's very, very good to see you again. I've seen you and met you before in Seattle. And Miss, is it Echohawk? Is that right? Thank you for your very, very important work. And keep it up. I mean, if there's ever a time in our nation's history when we needed people like you to do what you are doing, it is absolutely now. And Professor Rankin, it's awfully nice to see you. I apologize in advance. I'm going to have to leave probably before most of the panel does talk. But let me just say some things about taxes and specifically capital gains taxes, because I know people's eyes glaze over when you talk taxes, and especially when you talk something like capital gains taxes, people's eyes really glaze over. But the irony is that it's very important that you know this stuff, because it is at the heart of our dilemma. It's at the heart of the problems that we are facing in terms of trying to have a just society. It's hard to do what we need to do in society unless we have a tax system that finances the things we need to do. And you know this in Seattle. I mean, there is a crisis of affordable housing. That crisis of affordable housing, and it's not unlike the crisis in the Bay Area where I am now speaking to you from, is not just accidental. It doesn't just happen out of nature. It's not something that happened because no one paid attention. It's something that actually was intentional and is intentional in certain very important respects. And the tax system is a big part of it. Capital gains. Here it comes. Are you ready? Everybody ready? I'm going to quiz you. I'm going to quiz you on this later on. Capital gains, that's the difference between the value of an asset, whether it's a house or a car or a piece of art or anything else, the value of that asset when you buy it and when you sell it. That is called a capital gain. When the value goes up, and most values go up, I mean, even in a recession, housing values around the country continue to rise, and so do the values of all sorts of other assets. When those values rise, that is called a capital gain. And capital gains are very important in our society, particularly to the rich. Something like 2/3 of all capital gains in the state of Washington are claimed by households earning $1 million a year or more. I'm not saying that they were taxed on it. I mean, they get capital gains. Who are the people who get capital gains? They are rich. The people who get most of the capital gains are very rich. The people who claim and get almost all of the big and important prominent capital gains in our society are super rich. The reason that, for example, Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in our society, in our land, says that his secretary pays more taxes than he does, is because capital gains are taxed at a much lower rate. And it's easy for wealthy people to never pay capital gains taxes. Even if there's a capital gains tax, federal capital gains taxes, they can pass their money, their assets onto their children and heirs without ever paying taxes on those capital gains. And yet the capital is a source of income for the wealthy, like it is for nobody else. The other thing I want to just say is that this also bears on race and it bears on poverty. I mean, the median value of household assets among white people in the United States is 17 times the value of assets for Latinx households and 13 times the value of assets for Black households. In other words, and this is partly because of history of redlining, history of discrimination. One of the most important assets that anybody has is a house, obviously. And if you've been squeezed out of the housing market for a variety of reasons, you don't have any assets, you don't have resources. And that's one of the biggest explanations for the gap between Black and white assets, wealth. The other thing that's important to point out is that in Washington state, the poorest fifth of households pay an average of 18% of their incomes in taxes. I'm going to say that again because I know, there's a lot of numbers floating around here, but I'm going to say it again. The poorest fifth in Washington state pay an average of 18% of their income in taxes. The richest 1% in Washington state pay an average of 3% of their income in taxes. We're talking about state and local taxes. And Washington state, and I say this with great fondness for the state of Washington. I get up there whenever I can. Pre-COVID-19, I was up there all the time. The Seattle Town Hall, I practically lived there. But let me just say that Washington state has the most upside down tax code in America. I mean, it is worse, more regressive, harder on the poor than even in Mississippi. And last time I looked, the state of Washington was a pretty progressive place, a pretty blue place. The tax code is an abomination. It is a scandal.
Bob, can I jump in on a second there? Because I think that is a really important point to make. And I always remember, you make your students guess when we talk about regressive taxes in your class, which state is the most regressive. No one ever guesses Washington. That was always sort of an unpleasant part of the curriculum when that would come up, as I remember. But I want to pivot a little to talking, getting a little deeper into capital gains, and really start talking about like stocks and stock options, and like how that interfaces with the capital gains world, and also with sort of a history of how executive compensation is been done since the 90s in the United States at a much higher level. One of the really great parts of your documentary, Inequality for All, is touching on this, when there was sort of like a tying of CEO performance to the performance of the company in terms of compensation, there was a trend to seek a loophole, right? To like put capital gains in as the compensation mechanism. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that, because I think it is important, just so everyone kind of gets a sense of how there is just this big concentration and the disparities you just mentioned about how regressive Seattle's tax system is, that 3% number is partly due to the fact that we are in a state that taxes capital gains. And just wanted to maybe pivot it to stocks a little and kind of talk in that world.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, I will get to stocks, and I want just to finish this thought, Andrew, and that is that you've got a sales tax, and that is sales taxes are very regressive. The poor pay much more of their incomes because of sales taxes. But at the other end, Washington State is one of 11 states that doesn't have a capital gains tax, doesn't tax significant profits from the sales of stocks and bonds and other big assets. And that's a big deal right there. When I talk about capital gains, the biggest resource that most people have their wealth, if they're wealthy, in stocks and bonds. And if you're not paying capital gains at the top, particularly very, very wealthy people, that's the biggest loophole that exists. It is a giant loophole. I don't want to get personal because I've never met Mr. Bezos, but the last time I looked, he was the richest person, one of the richest in the world, certainly in the United States, and he had something in the order of 11% of the shares of stock of Amazon. Well, you have a lot of stock of Amazon. If you're one of the biggest shareholders of Amazon, every day you are getting richer and richer and richer, and none of that is subject to capital gains in the state. And you're getting whatever you can sell part of it, you can do anything you want. But if there's no capital gains, you can live a pretty good life without essentially paying any taxes.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate you bringing that up, just because we do in the state of Washington have actually a pretty large concentration of billionaires here in our county, in King County. All three of them, right? And like, again, I'm not saying anything to be disparaging to any of the billionaires in King County, but all three of them do make the reason they're billionaires is it's reflective of their holdings of stocks and bonds, and that is sort of the foundation to their wealth, and it is taxed at a very different rate. So I guess pivoting just a little bit to talk about like what the impact would be. So like if Senator Nguyen and I are successful and we pass capital gains regimes in Washington State, does that make a tax system more or less equitable, and how so?
Well, it makes it far more equitable for all the reasons that we've talked about. That is, the people that have most of the resources in Washington State or in the United States are very, very rich, and they hold their money, their wealth, in mostly shares of stocks and bonds. And billionaires in this pandemic have increased their billion wealth by something like $353 billion just so far. And again, I don't want to pick on Jeff Bezos. I'm sure he's a very nice man. But his wealth has gone up dramatically over the past 3 months. Most everybody else is barely holding on. We've got 43.5 million Americans who have filed for unemployment insurance. I mean, the gap is outrageous. And the cost of housing is one of the biggest problems that people face. And so it would only be just logical if you care about anything that is both fair and also good for the economy. This is not just fairness. This is also good for the economy, because if it means that average people have more money in their pockets because they can afford housing, that's good because they can spend more for everything else. That's critically important for your economy. This is not just a matter of doing good and being fair. It's a matter of just economic principles, understanding that the economy would work better if more middle class and working class and poor people had more money in their pockets, because housing was not as expensive as it is.
So let me dive into that just a little bit deeper and maybe phrase it this way. What do you say to critics? Because, there's a lot of folks out there, not only in Seattle, but a lot of other jurisdictions that are saying, look, we're going into a recession, maybe a depression. Why is this the time to raise any kind of tax? Like, why would you raise capital gains taxes or even institute one in a recession? And saying, that, like a line of argument that, I don't agree with it, but I want to hear your response, that by imposing a tax like that is going to somehow hamper recovery, it's going to delay recovery. How would you respond to, like, is a recession a good time to institute a capital gains tax?
A recession is the best time, because what we know about recessions is that people at the top don't get hurt by recessions. In fact, they do very well often. That's exactly what's happening in this recession. People at the top are doing better than ever. It's people who are working class and poor and lower middle class who are getting shafted. And they need services. They need social services. They need educational services. They need all sorts of services that states and locales provide. And yet the states are running out of money. The locales are running out of money. There are no tax money coming in from many people. Sales taxes are down because people don't have any money to buy things. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that if you tax people who are doing better and better, it's a small group at the top. They are doing extraordinarily well in order to finance services that everybody else desperately needs. Your economy is going to do better because people then have more money to spend. They don't have to worry as much. They have childcare, they have daycare, they have education, they have social services, they have unemployment insurance, they have all the other things they need to survive on. That's good. That's, again, I want to stress, this is not just a matter of fairness. This is a matter of smart economics.
Yeah. So, by making some of these investments, using capital gains, there's sort of a multiplier effect to the recovery as well. There's
a huge, and the multiplier effect is a kind of a technical term. What it really means is that when you put $1 into somebody's pocket, if they are low income or lower medium income, they are going to spend that dollar. If you put $1 into somebody's pocket who is a billionaire, they are not going to spend it. They're going to save it. They're going to put it into a work of art or buy another mansion in another place around the world, or they're going to put it into stocks and bonds. They're not going to spend it locally. They're not going to spend it in the state. And that's why it makes so much more sense to put $1 into a person's pockets who are people of moderate means or low income.
Well, and let me just ask you, this is sort of a technical question, but I think it's pretty universal across all the jurisdictions, federal and state, that do capital gains currently. Like if you own an asset, right? Because this is something that I've gotten a lot of feedback on from the community where there's some confusion. So like if you own a house, right, or you own stocks and bonds, you're not taxed purely on the ownership of those assets under stocks and under capital gains, correct?
No, of course not. No, you're taxed only when you sell them. And what your proposal, as I understand it, exempts retirement accounts and the sales of homes. And
yes. Oh, yes.
that,
Yes.
and so, well, you're not really hurting anybody, or at least you're not hurting middle income and lower middle income and working class people. No, you're really focusing where you should be focusing, and that is on very, very wealthy people who have never done better. And you're not penalizing them. You're just saying to them, pay your fair share.
And I got one last question on this, and then I might actually turn it over to the panel if anyone here has a clarifying question or two for Professor Reich before he has to leave. But we've talked a lot about how there's a very inequitable distribution of the assets taxed under capital gains, by race. That white households hold a lot more capital gains taxable assets than Black, Latinx, or Native American households. But I wanted to ask too, what about generationally, like in terms of capital gains? Like, how are capital gains assets distributed? Because I know a lot of people in my peer group, a lot of millennial peer groups are having a hard time getting into being sort of a property owning sort of generation, just because of how expensive a lot of assets are, and that there's a lot of barriers to entry, and we tend to be very debt laden. I'm just curious if like in terms of, I guess unless you're Mark Zuckerberg, I guess is a millennial, but him aside, who's doing quite well with capital gains.
Yeah,
there's also a generational divide.
Yeah, there's a huge generational divide, Andrew. I mean, boomers, baby boomers, of which I am one, we have a lot of assets relative to millennials and Generation Z. And that's partly because we've been around longer, we've earned more. But those of us who are fortunate enough to have amassed quite significant wealth, we are doing better than any generation before in terms of amassing that wealth. The top 1%, the richest 1% of the baby boomers have far more wealth than the richest 1% of the millennials. But here's the thing you want to focus on. When the baby boomers retire and they either die or they give their assets through a variety of vehicles to their heirs, they pay very little taxes and the heirs pay very little taxes. And so most of those capital gains go untaxed. And these days, that means you have the beginnings of an intergenerational, what can we call it? An oligarchy, an aristocracy? I mean, we haven't seen anything like this since the later days of the 19th century in terms of something in the order of $40 trillion are about to be transferred from wealthy baby boomers to millennials, wealthy millennials, because they're the children of wealthy baby boomers, without ever being taxed at all. I mean, this is the biggest loophole in history, and we are just on the precipice of the loophole. In fact, you can look into the loophole. From where you're standing, you can look down into a bottomless loophole. So it becomes even more important that you guys get on with what you are trying to do. And I salute you for it. I'm going to have to leave, but please do keep at it. This is really important. And even though the topic sounds boring, it is not boring. It's the key to the future of Seattle and the state of Washington.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. And thanks for being so generous with your time this afternoon. It looks like our attendees have spiked to 119 attendees on a Tuesday afternoon, which is great. So thank you so much. And really appreciate you taking the time here. And I hope to see you in person in some post-COVID world where we can get together in person again.
I hope so. I'm counting on that.
Either down at Berkeley or up here. So great. Really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. Thank you. And good luck to all of you.
Cheers. Okay, so folks, with that, I want to pivot and really start getting more down into the details here about the direction of actually crafting some kind of tax in Washington State on capital gains. I want to kind of go into this panel discussion here by just kind of flagging at the outset that I have not formally introduced at the city an ordinance yet. I'm still in the process of crafting one. And I just want to say that that process in kind of introducing to kick off the panel here, talking to Joe Nguyen a little bit, has been informed by the legislation that Joe Nguyen and others have been working on down in Olympia that creates what's called an excise tax, which, as Professor Reich was talking about, all of these capital gains taxes are taxes on transactions. It's not a tax on having a house, that's property tax, and it's not a tax on holding stocks. It's a tax, capital gains as envisioned in Olympia and envisioned in the legislation I will eventually introduce, is a tax on that transaction. Once you sell that capital and then the profit that you've made versus what you spent to buy whatever that property is, be it a capital gain from stock or from a house or whatever. Senator Nguyen and my efforts are pretty aligned. We're envisioning the same exemptions at the state and local level. But I want to turn it over to Senator Nguyen, who's been patiently waiting to jump in on this. And just
that was an honor to hear from Robert Reich. So
yeah, and just turn it over and give us an update on what the bill under consideration is in Olympia and what it does, how it's structured, and how we can kind of partner with our efforts here to have a more equitable system in the state of Washington.
No, first off, again, thank you so much for having me, and Sara and Colleen. It's always great to see both of you as well. I think the biggest thing that we're trying to address, even agnostic of the proposals themselves, is the fact that we want to invest not just in a budget that's whole, but an economy that serves all of us here in Washington State. And we've talked at length about how the regressivity really hurts, lower income or middle income families, and that manifests itself in many ways. If you look at our last recession, we made it basically an all cuts budget in Washington State. We didn't raise any revenue. We didn't have capital gains proposals or anything else. And then during that time, we let exemptions for large corporations kind of exist through that whole process. And you saw a higher concentration of wealth. So during the exact same time, we see tremendous growth in billionaires in Washington State. We also saw some of the worst issues around affordability and homelessness at the same time. So the inequality that we're experiencing is a symptom of our regressive nature. And then being able to close that gap with capital gains is one of the proposals that can make us whole. So the various proposals that you'll see, and Andrew, we've been talking about this as well. Obviously, we want to make sure that this affects larger income folks who have been very successful in the game of, I would say, capitalism, and they're doing just fine, even if it was a recession. We do not want to touch anybody's retirement accounts, nor their primary homes. And there were versions at the state level, too, that would have exempted percentages of a person's business, because oftentimes your livelihood depends on that to exist after you retire. So the goal was to make sure that it was the most equitable possible. And the thresholds were fairly high as well. So even if you were to sell some stock and you'd realize some gains, you'd have to realize a lot of gains. The smallest I saw was 50,000. So not selling just $50,000 worth of stock, which by itself is a lot of money, at least for somebody like me, that would just be the gains on that as well. So even if you were to sell and were lucky enough to have gains on potential stock holdings that you may have, you're likely going to be exempt from this proposal. So this is only for the ultra wealthy. And I believe by closing this gap, the important part that we're talking about is that we invest in our communities. So Sara's to talk more about our homelessness sectors, but we invest in our education, we invest in our healthcare, we invest in the future of Washington State. And that's how we have a more equitable society where everybody gets to participate in a meaningful way. What's interesting, my background is actually in finance and economics, or my degrees were at Santa University, and I worked in finance after the fact and saw firsthand how some of these folks are able to maneuver and not have to pay the same rates as other folks. And one of the things that kind of came to mind as we're talking about these proposals is that sometimes when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression, right? So a lot of the pushback that we're getting, why would you try to raise taxes during this time? Well, we've been raising taxes on middle-class families for so long. We need to close this budget shortfall because we can't afford to have a lack of funding for social services and for affordability. And there are people who are doing very, very well. And this is not meant to be punitive, or this is not a discussion about morality. This is literally an economic argument that we are all better when we have consumer demand that meets the needs of small businesses, of larger corporations. Even the billionaires themselves have workers who work for them, and they'd be better off if they had workers who were whole and able to be stable to work. So to me, the proposals themselves are numerous, but the main goal that we're trying to achieve is having a balanced economy that serves the people. People should come before profits, and our tax structure should reflect that as well here in Washington State.
So, Senator, just a couple follow-up questions too, yeah. And thank you so much for that presentation and just all the great work that you're doing for a more equitable tax code. I did just want to ask in terms of getting some of the details out, because I really think it's important for us to be really be front and center with the messaging on what this truly is. Like we scored just to kind of see like if it was flat, right? And the ultimate capital gains tax I put forward is not going to be a flat one. I mean, like the state one, we're gonna, you're going to have to raise above a certain threshold. But we started off saying like, well, what if it was flat? And even if it was flat, I mean, only 30% of people in the city of Seattle would pay it, which automatically, 70% wouldn't. Still a large number, but much better than sales tax, which everyone pays. Yeah. I guess my question would be like when you hike up those exemptions, right, where it's like, the 50,000 hurdle that you mentioned, like how many folks are we really talking about that ultimately pay this tax? Because I do think that is an important part of the messaging, is just being able to tell people like, look, because there is a lot of inequity in how capital gains are distributed, it really does tighten up the universe. So I just want to kind of talk about.
It's almost more important to discuss. Actually, about who pays or who doesn't really pay, and obviously the various proposals had different thresholds. As we were considering some, we'd had staff look at potentially where it would be coming from as well. And in Washington State, at the thresholds we were talking about, so above, say, for instance, $50,000 or $100,000, and retirement accounts don't count, primary homes don't count, your businesses don't count up to a certain amount. There were numerous counties in Washington State where they'd actually have nobody that would be paying it, because they wouldn't reach that threshold. Or I think Clark County had like one person, right? So obviously the majority of the folks would come from the Puget Sound area. And it's the irony there is that the folks who won't vote for it are going to be legislators from the counties who aren't actually impacted by this. So the interesting thing too is, as a proposal, you have the economic impact, which obviously is important, but even the political side of it, the people who are likely to pay for it, so those in King County, Puget Sound area, and obviously some other parts, they actually are the ones who are asking for something, because they understand that they should be paying a part of this recovery itself as well. So depending on how it's structured, obviously it would be, fractions of a percent of people here in Washington State, and only those, as we had talked about, would be making likely over $1 million, or worth at least over $1 million per year. And again, candidly, having worked in finance, the folks who are paying this, it's only because they've exhausted every other loophole that they had access to. So Professor Reich mentioned it earlier. There are numerous ways to not pay anything. So even exhausting all of those, then they'd have a little bit of liability that they'd be then paying for the state. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic where you have a really complex system that was set up to be unfair, as you had mentioned, the origins through executive compensation. And again, the vast majority of people, especially those middle and lower income folks, will not be impacted, and there's racial disparities associated with it as well. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but obviously racial equality is important all the time, but especially right now. I don't think I think the vast majority, I would candidly say, are probably generally older white males, and the benefits and the programs that we're going to be servicing by having these resources to invest in our state are going to go towards communities, BIPOC communities across the state as well. So, you have the economic argument, you have the political argument, but this, in terms of morality, when we talk about how do we have actual equity and justice in our society, this is one of the key pieces of it.
And Joe, that's an excellent. Sorry, Senator Nguyen. I don't want to get too.
We're friends, so it's hard to.
but I do want to pivot. I think that's a really great pivot to start talking to Colleen and Sara a little, because I think half of the equation is, can we have equitable taxes? And I think the other half is, what do we do with that revenue once we get it to, I said earlier, a multiplier effect on equity, right? But I think it is really important that it's not just enough to have equitable taxes. You also have to invest in equitable policy interventions. So I want to transition and then loop in the whole panel here to talk to Colleen and Sara about this. And just to sort of set the table a little bit on it, I think that it's never been, I've never seen a 6 months of American history, in my lifetime that has more queued up all of the different intersections of what we need to be doing at a particular moment. I was talking to someone the other day about this, that, it's not going to be enough that we rise to meet the goals that Third Door has laid out. And for those who are watching at home, the Third Door Coalition has put forward a proposal for 6,500 additional units of permanent supportive housing. So in addition to everything else in the pipeline, to meet our goals, to provide enough permanent supportive housing for what our anticipated future demand is going to be for people that are living chronically homeless. They've done a lot of great assessment and analysis of the massive caseload savings that can be realized through something like that, in terms of, a third of the cost of jail, like a fraction of the cost of emergency rooms, and that people that are chronically homeless have traditionally been, to use like a really bureaucratic term, just high utilizers of those caseload systems. But I think this is where the really big intersection really comes, is it puts front and center just the glaring racial and social equity challenge that we face with chronic homelessness, and that our intervention and our challenge to address the problem needs to rise to the scope of that challenge. And I think we've got a lot of great examples in recent history where we in Seattle, King County have made really good progress on some big policy areas, but still had massively inequitable results. We have the second lowest youth incarceration rate in America, and we should be proud of that we incarcerate youth at a much lower rate than other jurisdictions. But average length of stay has gone up for young people. The percent of people of color who are incarcerated of the smaller group has gone up. So inequity has gone up as total population has gone down, which tells me that we're really good at not putting white kids in jail when we put our mind to it, but that those inequities still persist for people of color in our community. I think that we see it manifested in lots of other places. Police use of force since the consent decree is down, but it's still stubbornly very high for people of color who are victims of force from the police. So as we get into this work now with permanent supportive housing, I am really excited to queue up for introducing Colleen and Sara to start really talking about the fact that we have this great opportunity now in this moment to tax capital gains, which, as we've discussed, overwhelmingly held by rich white men, and use those resources to drive equity-driven conversations in scaling up, expanding, and protecting permanent supportive housing to get folks inside and in a way where race and social justice is centered, so that we don't repeat our recent history of addressing these social problems, but not centering equity and leading to inequitable results. So with that, I want to turn it over. I know I've introduced them a number of times, but just to remind the audience, Professor Sara Rankin, a law professor at the Seattle University and the director of the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project, and a co-chair of the Third Door Coalition to scale up permanent supportive housing. And then Colleen Echohawk, executive director of the Chief Seattle Club, and operator of permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and other services for chronically homeless individuals. Both experts that can delve in and talk a little bit more about this, because I don't think it's enough it's not a plan to propose a tax. The tax is a means, but we got to talk about the ends now. So let's talk about permanent supportive housing. So why don't we start with Colleen first? A lot of folks in the community, they hear permanent supportive housing, but they don't know, are you talking about tiny house villages? Are you talking about scatter site? Are you talking about, housing integrated into a hospital? So I want to start from you first as an operator, what is permanent supportive housing?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. And I just have to say that I appreciated the Secretary's comment on like, this could be a boring topic, but it's been fascinating. I've learned a lot and feel really excited to share a little bit about the importance of permanent supportive housing in our community. And so the idea that for us in the Native community and the Seattle Club and the Coalition to End Urban Indigenous Homelessness, permanent supportive housing is a way to bring in our folks who've been suffering for a very long time of chronic homelessness and bring them into shelter and security that is permanent. And I think that's a very important part of understanding permanent supportive housing. We're not talking about tiny villages or other non-permanent housing, but we're talking about housing that is permanent. We're also talking about housing that has services attached to it. So housing that understands the incredible trauma that our folks who've been experiencing chronic homelessness that's happening with them. It's ongoing trauma. And so we're gonna have to address that if we want to bring them into security and out from living out on the streets. And so the Seattle Club has been operating Eagle Village, which is a PSH light housing, we call it. And this has been incredibly successful for our community. One thing I'd like to remind us all is that even within our homeless housing systems, racism and discrimination continue to plague the BIPOC communities. And so it has been very important, and I'd love to give big props to the executive in King County, because we took a risk to understand that the Native community, who experience the highest rates of homelessness in our country and in our county, should have a place that is for them to address those very specific needs. So our PSH is excellent. It has to be done, but it also has to come, we have to think about it with an anti-racist lens in order to be successful. So I am really grateful that we're having this conversation. We have to build more PSH that is anti-racist in our system. And we have to ensure that we're breaking down the structural racism that keeps people of color out of PSH as we move forward.
And Colleen, I'll stick with you just for a second to flesh that out a little bit more, because I think that is an extremely important point, and it needs to be centered. And I think Chief Seattle Club has been a great model of interventions that are successful in breaking that down. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more too about like some of the policy interventions that myself, my colleagues on the council, and other local leaders could use to start like really putting rubber to the road on making sure that we're focusing on this work in that way.
The number one thing I think for us right now in King County and in the city of Seattle, especially with everything that has been happening, is to fund POC-led organizations. If you think about our entire system, our system has been set up mostly by white people for white people to succeed. And so, and that goes for our homeless system. I know there's incredible, amazing white allies and co-conspirators who are behind this, but they do not truly know the pain and the trauma of our community. And they don't know the cultural solutions to help solve for BIPOC homelessness. So, and when I say BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so that is the number one thing I can think of right now, is to be funding the Urban League, and be funding Africatown, and be funding United Indians of All Tribes. And that is an equitable response. If we continue to fund white-led solutions around homelessness, we will not find the solutions to homelessness. And so I believe that when we're thinking about, effective solutions, that is just one of the ways that we can be effective. And when I say this, I don't mean any kind of ill will to any of our white-led organizations. They've been doing an amazing job, and have in fact been doing it, remarkable in centering race and equity. But part of the way that we center race and equity, and part of the way that we find effective solutions, is to do it through POC-led organizations.
Yeah, and I think that that's really good feedback too, in terms of when we come up with sort of a dedicated spend bill like this, right? Mm-hmm. Like kind of baking those values into like when we're doing RFPs, like how are we prioritizing them, right, in terms of where the money's going. So I appreciate that. So Professor Rankin, moving on to you, and then we'll open up the panel a little bit more here for questions as well. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the overarching goals of like Third Door Coalition. What is Third Door Coalition? And just more about like how you came up with the goals and just how the Third Door kind of framework and the Third Door plan can really make a big substantive difference in chronic homelessness in King County. So a broad question, but I think important to hitch up this tax proposal to like what will we, the people of Seattle King County, be getting if we do pass a tax like this?
Thank you, Councilmember, and I want to thank you for your leadership, and thank you, Colleen, for I really appreciated your contributions, and it's always exciting to be talking with both of you. So you asked about what the Third Door Coalition is. In terms of a very quick overview, I can give that to you, but you can also go to thirddoorcoalition.org, which is our website. It has all the information that you could possibly want, and then possibly more than you'd want to have. But we are an unlikely alliance. We call ourselves an unlikely alliance because we're very focused on trying to bring together people who seem like they would have convergent or divergent interests, and to show how they're convergent, particularly around the question of how we can work together to solve unsheltered chronic homelessness. And so our coalition has spent the last 2 years analyzing what it would take to dramatically reduce our chronic homeless population through the bringing supportive housing to scale. And so we conducted 2 analyses. First, we did a needs assessment to determine the gap between the existing supportive housing stock that we have in our area and what the need for it is. And then we conducted a cost driver analysis to identify what the biggest drags were on cost and time to construct permanent supportive housing so that we could more effectively bring it to scale. And so based on our analysis, we determined that at least 6,500 people suffer from unsheltered chronic homelessness in King County. That's about twice the number of prior point in time count estimates. And we think there's many compelling reasons to be prioritizing our response to unsheltered chronic homelessness. And it's important, I guess, to sort of spend a second just saying, I think a lot of folks don't know the difference between homelessness generally and chronic unsheltered homelessness in particular. People who experience chronic homelessness represent only about 30% of our overall homeless population in King County. But by definition, and there's actually a federal definition for chronic homelessness, people experiencing chronic homelessness are homeless longer than most people who experience homelessness only temporarily or momentarily. And by federal definition, they suffer from a disabling condition and often multiple conditions that prevent them from working or maintaining housing. And examples of those disabilities can be chronic health problems, substance use disorders, severe untreated mental illness, severe physical disabilities, and it's often a co-occurrence of all of those sort of circumstances together. And it's the presence of those disabling conditions that helps to explain the persistence of their homelessness. But it also helps to explain why the solution that we advance, which is supportive housing, works. And so Colleen did a wonderful job explaining what supportive housing is. It's non-time limited housing that has wraparound services available. But I also want to explain what it's not. It is not a handout. And I hear this a lot from people. It is not a handout. Residents who residents of supportive housing generally will contribute up to 30% of their income, which for this population is primarily disability benefits that many people didn't even know they were eligible for until they went into supportive housing and had the support that they needed in order to file for and receive those benefits. And they also sign a lease that has many typical renter provisions that you would expect to see in any sort of lease. So it's important to understand what it is. It's important to understand what it's not. And then the last thing I'll say before I stop is I really want to hit home on the cost effectiveness of supportive housing for chronic homelessness. Councilmember Lewis mentioned that a lot of people experiencing chronic homelessness are high frequency users of emergency room services, first responder time. They're also dragged through the criminal justice system at pretty unprecedented rates, which is the most expensive and least effective way to respond to the problem. On the flip side of that, supportive housing has been shown consistently, and you can go to the Third Door website and look at decades of studies from all different sorts of entities that have studied this issue and have determined that providing people with supportive housing is the most humane and cost-effective way to address chronic homelessness. And all of us have a shared interest in solving our unsheltered chronic homelessness crisis. So hopefully that's a bit of an overview of why the Third Door is focused on this area. And I would, as I mentioned before, I'd invite people to visit our website for more information.
I want to ask a couple of really quick questions, then pivot to our audience questions. But Professor Rankin, can you talk a little bit about the capital and operating costs that you've identified for like the goal number of what Third Door has outlined, and how like 37 to 40 million, which is sort of what the ballpark of what we're looking to do with the city and a capital gains tax, why that number kind of fits in well with the metrics that you've identified.
Sure, certainly. So our proposal, and we offered this framework essentially as a public good. I should stress that we're just a group of volunteers. It's not, we're not a corporate-backed, entity, or we're just that unlikely group of folks that have come together to really try and push this issue. So the framework that we offered was based on hundreds and hundreds of conversations that we had with all sorts of unlikely allies about how we could bring supportive housing to scale. So the framework that we offered calls for a public-private partnership of $1.6 billion in capital that would allow us to bring supportive housing to scale in the region. And it's important to recognize too, I think that framework is even more important now. It was always important, but it's even more important now in the grips of the pandemic, when we have a lot of our private businesses, especially our small businesses, are struggling, and at the same time, our government coffers are being stressed. And so that sort of partnership is really important because government alone can't end homelessness. It's our collective responsibility to do it. So this framework would be a legislatively created public-private partnership, something akin to the Opportunity Scholarship Fund. There's a bunch of other successful precedent that has been pursued at the state level, and that would be broken down into allocations that would be 10% from the city, 30% from the county, 20% from the state, and 40% from business. And that would allow us to have the capital build. And we are having a series of strategy sessions on how we would be, and we've got ideas for this, and we invite people to participate in these strategy sessions. But where the operating costs are a separate piece that we think would need to be funded, obviously, on a continuous basis, to make sure that we're sufficiently paying our social working, our social workers and other treatment providers, housing providers, such as Colleen's group and others who do such important work, really to build the necessary capacity to be able to support these housing projects.
Great, and thank you so much for the work that you and the rest of your unusual group of allies are doing, Professor Rankin. And it's been great to work with you so far during this term on the council. So, with that, I mean, why don't we pivot to the audience? Take about a half an hour or so of questions, and close out the town hall. So, Camila, do we have any questions ready?
Yes, we do. I want to say thank you to all of the panelists. This has been very interesting, and I've also learned a lot by listening to this presentation. I'm going to start with the first question that I have here for Senator Nguyen and Councilmember Lewis. And the question is, if the Internal Revenue Service defines gains from the sale of capital assets as income, and the Washington State Constitution expressly prohibits a tax on income, why does the council continue to promote this strategy?
It actually doesn't expressly prohibit it. It prohibits property. So the definition was back from 1930. The ruling was done during the last Great Depression. So the Constitution doesn't actually prohibit the income. It's actually something separate. So you look at capital gains, look at how it operates. You only trigger capital gains when you sell something. So if you sold a car, if you bought, something, that's when you trigger a sales tax. So this is very similar to that type of model. And semantically too, if that's the argument, then if we think that it is the same, then income gets taxed at a different rate than capital gains. So if they think that income is the same as capital gains, well, then do you want to charge at the same rate? And the federal government also has a tax on income. So it's kind of, you're picking and choosing at that point. But at the end of the day, look, you're right. It's going to probably be challenged in the court. And in fact, I guarantee there's going to be challenged in the court. And I think we should have that discussion. But when we're talking about income inequality, we're talking about investments in our community, I think that is the focus of what we're trying to achieve and making sure that we do it in an equitable way. But the Constitution doesn't actually prohibit income. It's separate, it's property.
Yeah, and I don't really have much to add to that. Senator Nguyen did an awesome job responding to that question. It is a good question, and I appreciate the audience member that asked it. I guess the only thing to put a fine point on it is just to say that the city has the same excise tax authority as the state. And that's what it is ultimately. An excise tax is a tax for the privilege of engaging in a transaction, basically. And we've got all sorts of examples of excise taxes, real estate excise tax, that we already are currently using in the state of Washington. This would be the first application of an excise tax on an individual rather than a business. So that would be mostly the basis of the challenge. But I think we got a good argument. That just because we haven't done it before doesn't mean that we don't have the power to do it. We've just opted not to. But that is how the state is drafting theirs, and that is how I intend to draft mine as well. And like I said earlier, it's the same excise tax authority that the state has that we would be using. So I think we can just leave it at that. If you send me an email, I'm happy to talk more about it for sure.
Second question is related to some of the things you just discussed. Does a capital gains tax stand a better chance of passing than a wealth tax? By passing, the person means approved by the courts and defeating the inevitable IMN initiative.
Yeah, that's another good question. I guess the only thing I would add to my previous response, and Joe could jump in on this too if he wants to, but you could probably do a wealth tax as a tax on intangible property. Because wealth, if you own like a painting by Picasso, or if you own, like kind of a lot of the other stuff that were in Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, for example, we could probably do that as a tax on intangible property. It would be subject to the 1% limit that is constitutional and is explicit. That's not what I'm proposing. But I think that would be very hard to administer. You'd have to have people go out and appraise all their wealth and verify it somehow. And not saying that it's not a worthy cause, but that's something I'd rather see probably done by Senator Warren at the federal level than something that we would pursue here, just given our limitations as a city and how we could institute it and how we could enforce it. But it is a good question.
This next question is for Colleen. It says, I live in Pioneer Square and I see the homeless population visibly growing in our neighborhood almost daily. And our city services garbage, as an example, is not cleaning the streets. I talk to many people daily and they have no idea where to go for support. Where would you direct them?
Colleen, you want to jump on that one?
I was like, Councilmember Lewis should answer that one. Yeah, really happy to answer that. Well, the number one thing I'll say is that in front of the Chief Seattle Club every single day since COVID happened, we've been feeding anyone who comes anywhere who would like to come. So I feel like I know we're doing about 300 meals a day for any of our folks out there who are experiencing homelessness. The other thing I would say that we do have limited resources in Pioneer Square right now. There's been agencies that have had to shut down because of active COVID in their population. So the Compass Center has just been doing a tremendous job. They are right there in Pioneer Square. They're the ones who are open the most right now. They have the most bathrooms. We've had to shut our bathrooms down at Chief Seattle Club because of weren't adequate to the COVID response that we needed to do. So Compass Center has just been amazing. Food is available from 8 to 10 a.m. and right in front of the Chief Seattle Club. And then I guess the other thing I would say is that we just need more resources. There's just not enough in Pioneer Square right now. There are some bathrooms at City Hall Park. They're just porta potties. There's also some resources over by King Street Station. But the reality is that we just need more resources, and they're trickling in, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done. Finally, I'll say that one of the things that is of biggest concern for me is behavioral health resources. We have folks who are living in Pioneer Square right now who are not like in hotel rooms, because a lot of our folks are in hotel rooms, the homeless community right now, but they didn't make it because they've just been suffering with tremendous mental health situations for a very long time. And when I think about our homeless population in Pioneer Square at the moment, my heart breaks for them. We should all be completely outraged that we have gotten to this situation where our beloved homeless communities, our relatives, our brothers, our sisters, that they are suffering tremendously, and we are not doing enough to support them. I wish I had much better news on that, and maybe Councilmember Lewis he probably does.
Well, let me say this. I am hopeful that in our current budget conversation, we're going to have some more resources to get folks off the street into a place where they can live with dignity and not be, down in Pioneer Square or any other neighborhood for that matter, where they're currently experiencing chronic homelessness. Councilmember Mosqueda, Councilmember Morales, and I have been really, really avid that the city kind of sees the sort of state of emergency on this and really look at ways to scale up temporary transitional placements, like until we get permanent supportive housing online, be it tiny house villages, be it modular housing, be it one of which, Colleen, Chief Seattle Club recently scaled up a modular transitional shelter in Soto that is great. Hoteling. There's all sorts of different strategies people are using, working with Co-Lead, which has actually been doing a lot of work, law enforcement assisted diversion program in Pioneer Square, getting folks out of chronic homeless encampments and into hotels that are supported by King County, I think, is supporting that effort in conjunction with us. So, I'm working on it through this summer budget session. The hope is that council members, Mosqueda, Morales, and I are going to get an ad to scale up more of those transitional placements. And it's a huge priority for me. I hear from constituents all the time, and I see it myself when I go into the office in Pioneer Square, the urgency that is needed, and I share it with you.
Could I just, I just wanted to sort of add in on that. I think the question that was asked is such a great question, because a lot of folks think that there are just so many services and so many behavioral health options that are available, or even just shelters. And even folks who do this work day in and day out, don't have great places, great options in terms of places to refer people, because there's such a shortage. And so people who experience unsheltered chronic homelessness learn fairly early on that even when an offer of service or treatment is extended, that it's not really a meaningful offer, because even if they go someplace, they might not be eligible. They have to find transportation there. They may have a barrier to treatment. There's very, very common, staggering lists of barriers that prohibit people from being able to access services and treatment that could help lift them out of homelessness. And the other piece of it too is that as important as services and treatment are, and this goes back to the point about supportive housing, without the stability of housing, this is what all of those studies show that are on our website, is that people need the platform of stable housing in order to be able to rebuild their lives. They need that stability in order to be able to benefit from services and treatment at higher levels and in a more robust way. So in order to do, have meaningful work, of course, we have to do emergency services. We have to have a Band-Aid response. But ultimately, what we need is housing, and supportive housing is that housing with services and wraparound services available that allow people to both live with dignity and really be able to achieve, higher levels of recovery from the various challenges that they're facing.
I just want to jump in one more time. Just one quick thing. It'll be fast. Is that what's been exciting about hoteling? So like Chief Seattle Club has like 75 to 100 people right now in hotel rooms. DESC has hundreds. We've somewhere around like 700 to 800 folks have been in hotels because of COVID. They are doing so well. Of course, there's some that are struggling but it's a small percentage. To Sarah's point, getting them into that stability, getting to that place where you can have your own space to lay down, to use the bathroom, to just have human dignity. That's what we're talking about, is just human dignity. To give people that place of stability and security is changing people's lives. Like, I am so excited to see what happens, because I'm seeing a lot of really great leadership from the city and from the county to think about, how do we keep people in these hotel rooms? How do we buy hotels? How do we figure out ways to make this better for this community? And I also want to just add to the Pioneer Square question specifically, that on Tuesdays and Thursdays in front of the Chief Seattle Club, we're also offering COVID-19 testing for any of our homeless community that is in that area, which is really, really important, so that they have access to testing and services. And that is in partnership with the amazing, amazing organization, Seattle Indian Health Board, who is offering those services to anyone who needs COVID-19 testing.
Thank you so much for flagging that service, Colleen. Yeah. And more prescient than ever, unfortunately. And
yeah.
And just to put a pin too on the hoteling a little bit, it's been amazing, because co-lead started as, taking folks experiencing homelessness who were let out of King County Jail to de-intensify the jail at the beginning of COVID. King County Jail costs us about $200 a night to keep someone there. Co-lead is hoteling people at a cost of $69 a night. So I mean, I don't want to, I'm making that point last, because I think all the points about it just being good policy have already been made. But to put a pin on it, for the taxpayer, it's a good decision as well. It gets better results and costs a lot less. So Camila, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. This question is a two-part. Can the City Council enact a local capital gains tax absent of specific authorization from the state legislature? And then the second part is, Councilmember Lewis, does your proposal come with a complimentary cut in the city's sales tax?
Yeah, good question. So first off, I actually did look into doing some potential reforms on our sales tax. Like, we have the highest sales tax in a state that already has a high sales tax, in the city of Seattle. the way that the sales tax is administered and collected, we actually don't have the ability, unfortunately, as a city to go in and mess too much with the sales tax. That's something that Olympia would have to do. So, when I answer the rest of the question, I'll turn it over to Senator Nguyen, and maybe we could talk a little bit too about what I think is a worthy cause, which is really having a serious discussion about how we lower regressive taxes as well, in addition to instituting progressive ones. On the authority from Olympia, we do have authority as a charter city, as I kind of discussed earlier, around being able to impose excise taxes. So it's not explicitly a tax on capital gains as such. And in fairness, Senator Nguyen and I, both of our proposals, they're not strict taxes on capital gains. There are taxes on certain capital gains with others exempted. And we can do that under an excise tax where we have a lot of authority to sort of plug and play with it. But that is the source of authority for both the state and the city is under our excise taxing authority. Of course, as we discussed earlier, some folks will argue that is outside the scope of the authority. And, I welcome that discussion because I think it's squarely within it. And I'm sure Senator Nguyen agrees, but I'll turn it over to.
Yeah, no, I agree. Obviously we have a judicial system and we have a democracy with checks and balances. And I think these are tough conversations that we need to have in terms of how we should invest in our economy and invest in our people. But I do agree in that we, in every opportunity, should try to lower taxes for middle and working class families because they've been taking the brunt of the regressive policies that we have in place right now, especially when it looks even like small businesses, right? Like the vast majority of small businesses, you can actually exempt them from B&O by raising rates for larger corporations at a very nominal rate, who pay overall a little bit less, a lot less than most people as well. So I think in these conversations, that is the ultimate goal, is to not just raise revenue for investments in our community, but how do we then try to balance it out and then lower the burden for working in middle class families in other ways possible as well.
Yeah, so Camila, why don't we do, because I know we're going to lose Professor Rankin soon as well, why don't we do one more question, and then we can kind of close out the town hall with some closing remarks from folks. So who's up next, or what question's up next?
Can I ask two questions? I think this one will be pretty quick.
Sure.
The question is, I assume the exemption on homes is for a primary residence and not a second home or an income property?
Yeah, so, I haven't actually finished drafting my ordinance yet. And that would be my intention, is to craft an ordinance that is sort of as close to the parameters of the state one as possible. Because like I said before, right. And so, yeah, so since in the state one, that is the nature of that exemption, I would want to try to model that in my ordinance as well, because I don't want to have a situation where we have a broader city liability or narrower city liability than the state one, just in terms of administrability and confusing people. So that'll probably be what is reflected when we do finally put our ordinance together.
Okay, and this can be our final question. It's a question for Senator Nguyen. It says, why doesn't the state of Washington pay for these social services and homelessness, et cetera? Why put the onus on the city of Seattle? And it draws attention to our property revenue that is raised here in the city of Seattle as floating like kind of the rest of the state's public services. And so the concern, and I think the question reads to, if Seattle adds a capital gains tax and it's not done in lockstep with like other jurisdictions, will people start to like move to other areas? And this will be kind of an already, you're living in one city, but using another city as your primary residence and getting out of it. And this person is really concerned about that. So
that's a very real possibility. And candidly, you see a little bit right now bleed across to the east side of even just I-90. And the state absolutely should be paying more. Obviously, there's a lot more need. Maybe you hear my son yelling at me right now on the side. The state certainly needs to invest more in our infrastructure. So what's interesting is that our budget is fairly constrained in terms of what we can spend our money on, or what we should be spending our money on. And from a constitutional perspective, it's largely on K-12 education. And because of some recent, lawsuits with McCleary and others, a lot of the resources kind of were sucked to those specific efforts, which are important. However, it's still finite, right? Like we don't have income tax, we don't have capital gains. We know that we have mental health issues. We know that we have homelessness issues. We know that we have a lot of issues. We definitely have a transportation issue. So if the state could pay for more, I absolutely think that we should. That's just not the realistic proposal that we have at this moment. And that's why I think Andrew's pushing for this legislation. That's why we're doing it at the state level as well, is to get new revenue to actually fund these things because we haven't in the past.
Yeah, so I applaud whoever asked that question. I probably could have asked that question myself. Why aren't we getting more money, Joe? But I appreciate it, and I do think that is why syncing up this conversation of having a state and a local capital gains tax at the same time is better, obviously, than having just the city Seattle have one and like nowhere else in the state have one. I think we got a lot of really good examples of taxes where there is like local share or like a local addition. I mean, like I said earlier, people in Seattle pay more in property, sales tax, real estate excise tax, B&O tax. I mean, you go down the list, all of our taxes in Seattle are slightly higher than the rest of the region because we have elected to raise them higher to pay for, actually, among other things, pretty much all the social services for the entire region, for the most part, in our budget. So I think that capital gains should follow in that same trajectory. Like, I think we should have a bigger state one. And just for the record, I think the state one, comes in at, like, what is it, Joe? Is it like 5%, 7% at the highest bracket? Do you remember?
9.
Sorry?
9%.
9%. So,
it depends. It depends which version you look at, but the governor's version was 9%.
Right. On like that highest bracket. So for the city one, I am thinking more in like the 0.5% to 2% range for different brackets laid out as an excise tax. So I mean, it would be a smaller additive one that would go on top of it. Probably not enough to incentivize moving and leaving if there was already a state one that you're paying anyway. And there's all sorts of reasons why people want to live in the city of Seattle, besides just shopping for how much you pay in tax. And that's been the case with a lot of our other taxes in our current system. And I would hope that it continues to be the case with capital gains as well. But anyway, I think that's a good question to end on. I do want to give our guests an opportunity maybe to say just a couple closing words. Professor Rankin, I know you need to leave soon, so maybe starting with you, and then sign off.
Thanks. I have been learning a lot in this conversation. I love the questions. They're extremely interesting to me. I think obviously, I want to thank you, Councilmember Lewis, and you, Senator Nguyen, and you, Colleen, for investing so much time and passion in this important project. And I think if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that housing is healthcare. And that's not just healthcare for people experiencing chronic homelessness. It's really essential to our collective public health. And we're in the middle of a crisis. We have to triage. Housing and health are essential to our entire regional recovery. And so I really thank you for taking bold and urgent steps to address a long overdue issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Colleen, any closing remarks?
Yeah, well, thanks to everyone on the call. It's been really, really interesting. I just have to think about where I'm sitting right now. I'm sitting in North Seattle in a middle income home that I own. And I'm thinking about all of us who live in this region. We greatly benefit from the land and water of the Coast Salish communities. The many very wealthy people who live in this region benefit greatly from our native people in this area. Some of the nicest Indians in the whole world live in this region. And I think about that a lot because I know that I have to think about my benefit. When I think about the folks at the Chief Seattle Club who we serve, we have a program called Native Works that gets people back, people who've been experiencing chronic homelessness, get them back to work. I'm remembering the program manager called me one day and said, we've had this guy who's been in here for 9 months. We had him do his taxes. He owes taxes. This is someone who is currently homeless, who's trying to get their life back together, and they're asked to pay a tax. And it blows my mind even to this day. And we've had to figure out how to make sure that we can pay them as part of pay their taxes as part of the apprenticeship program. We have good people in this region. We talked about Jeff Bezos quite a bit. I follow him on Instagram. He was awesome about Black Lives Matter. I don't know him personally, but I want to believe something good about every person in this region. And I'm asking everyone on this call to think about what our responsibility is to our folks who are experiencing poverty at such high rates, including Native people who have the highest rates of poverty in this region, highest rates of infant mortality. 11% of Native babies will die in this region. That's because of poverty. That's because of lack of housing. That's because of the generational historical trauma. And we can do better in this region. This is, to me, a no-brainer way that we can encourage and lift up our communities who've been experiencing such disparity. So thank you all for the time. I hope maybe Jeff Bezos heard that. Who knows?
Well, it was complimentary, so it's
I was like, come on, Jeff, you can do it.
All right, Senator Nguyen, close us out.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I think at the end of the day, this isn't about taxes. This isn't about, it's about people, right? We're investing in people. We're trying to make sure that we have a society that serves all of us in a way that is fair and just. And being able to do that is this proposal that Andrew has. And I think it's a good start to a conversation that we desperately need in Washington State, because we're very regressive, right? Like, we have models of our tax structure on top of Idaho's and how much more that would bring in just because of how much more fair Idaho's is compared to this. So the biggest thing for me is the takeaway is that we as a society, like Colleen said, we should prioritize people over profits. And you're right. I think I don't know him personally as well, but I do know that there are very forward-thinking people who care about the environment, who care about our communities, who want to alleviate homelessness. And that's why we have a Third Door Coalition with Sara, with some unlikely allies, because we all understand that we're in this together. And this is just one of those mechanisms to solve big problems here in Seattle and Washington State. And it's just an honor to be a part of a larger group having this conversation. I don't feel like we've had this before in the past, and the fact that we have this type of engagement across the spectrum has been very uplifting. So I'm hopeful for this proposal, but other ones as well.
Thank you so much, Senator Nguyen. And just to make a couple closing remarks myself on that theme, I definitely want to echo the points that you just made around the fact that it is about people. And that's why, honestly, that's why I wanted to meld this town hall and this conversation between equitable taxes and permanent supportive housing, because I do think they're inextricably linked. I've always held that, we should have plans first, taxes second. And once I saw that, with the Third Door's regional plan of, 6,500 new units of permanent supportive housing, penciling the city in for 10%, and that 10% over, 5 years was going to be $32.5 million a year. And that a capital gains tax along these lines could bring in about $37 million, and that fit pretty neatly. These are the kinds of conversations we need to be having, where we can advance equitable policies through equitable taxes instead of constantly resorting to the choice that we've always been given in the past as Washingtonians, which is to raise property taxes, to raise sales tax, to raise B&O taxes that fall very heavily on small businesses because of the way that they're structured. So I really appreciate Joe, Colleen, Sara, and obviously earlier Secretary Reich for joining us to have this conversation today. To members of the public too, I would say, as I've mentioned multiple times, I haven't actually formally introduced an ordinance yet. So I am still in a position where feedback is very, very much welcome and appreciated. Obviously some stuff came out from the questions and from the panel today that are going to inform that process. And I really do encourage folks, to continue to email my office at andrew.lewis@seattle.gov, continue to follow the activities of the council, sign up for my newsletter on my website, seattle.gov/council/Lewis, and where you can also sign up for office hour appointments every week. Try to keep a good number of slots open and always accessible to talk in person and about this or other topics in the district. So do not hesitate to reach out. We're 1 minute over time. So good job, everybody. We kept it pretty tight. And with that, I think we'll sign off. Thank you so much. Really appreciate everybody coming in here, and thank you for all the service you do in the community in District 7 and beyond. So thank you.